I'd like to call upon Venerable Lumpur Khemadhammo to open the proceedings for this afternoon's short half-day conference, The Bringer of Light. Lumpur Khemadhammo, please offer some opening comments to begin the afternoon for us, or the morning or the evening, depending on what part of the planet one is on.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming you all to this half-day conference, and especially because we have Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi talking to us this afternoon. It was 2 years ago when we had our conference in Birmingham, and he came and was the keynote speaker for that. And while he was here, he spent one night here and gave a talk here. And I can remember, as I introduced him here, commenting on the volume of work that he's produced. I can't even imagine typing it all out, let alone actually reading it in the Pali, translating it, putting it into good English, and putting it into a final preparation for printing. It's quite beyond me to imagine how much work that would entail. Bhikkhu Bodhi is probably, I think, the most foremost person, expert on the Pali Canon in the world. So we are very honored to have him here today, and very much in his debt for the amount of work that he's produced over the years. So thank you very much for coming today, Bhikkhu Bodhi, and we look forward enormously to hearing you. So I'll send it back to Ajahn Amaro now to introduce Bhikkhu Bodhi, and I hope everyone will have a very enjoyable conference. It's a very important work that we're doing, bringing the light of the Dhamma to the West. And of course, it poses many challenges, as many of us know, who've been doing this for some time. And I hope what Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi has to say today, and what you glean from the conference, will be an enormous help in this important work of spreading the Dhamma. So over to you, Ajahn Amaro.
Thank you very much, Lumpur. And I also echo my sentiments of great gratitude for Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi being available to help lead the the offering of reflections this afternoon and to address this theme. He has been in robes as a monk of the Southern Buddhist tradition, the Theravada tradition, for 50 years. As a samanera for a year under the guidance of Venerable Ananda Maitreya, and then as a bhikkhu. I believe this is your 49th reigns as a bhikkhu this year. Is that correct, Venerable? Something like that. So he was...
I had my first Vasa in 1973. I have to do some subtraction to calculate the number of years. I lose track of that.
I believe you're in your 49th reigns.
This will be the 49th, yeah.
Thank you. So Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi did a PhD in philosophy in Claremont Graduate University in New York, and initially took samanera ordination in the Vietnamese tradition. Then after his formal education in the West, then went to Sri Lanka, studied under the guidance of Venerable Ananda Maitreya, who was a great mentor of Sangha here in the UK, as well as many other places. As Lumpur Khemadhammo referred to, he's been extraordinarily abundant and appreciated in his role as a translator. He's, I would say, the preeminent translator of Pali into English, and the primary go-to reference for reading the Pali Canon in English. And so there's an immense gratitude that those of us practicing in this tradition have for him and his extraordinary efforts over the years, along with his translation and other written works on the say commentaries on the Pali Canon and so forth. Then he was the editor of the English language editor of the Buddhist Publication Society in Sri Lanka for many years, taking over from Venerable Nyanaponika Thera. And he also established a charity called Buddhist Global Relief, which funds projects to fight hunger and to empower women across the world. He now lives and teaches at Chuang Yen Monastery in Carmel, New York, and is also the president of the Buddhist Association of the USA. So please, without further ado, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, please offer your reflections on our theme for the day, and we very eagerly look forward to hearing what you bring to the gathering on this occasion.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I want to thank the Theravada Buddhist Association of the UK, particularly Longpur Khemadhammo and Achan Amaro, for inviting me again this year to give the address to your gathering. 2 years ago, I traveled in person to Great Britain to give the address at the gathering in Birmingham. And I think that was just maybe my last overseas travel before the COVID pandemic struck and made international travel virtually untenable. Okay, so the topic of this symposium today is, the main title is The Bringer of Light, but then the subtitle is what it means to be a Dhammaduta in an Occidental environment or a Western environment. And so I've proceeded by trying to tackle each of the terms in the subtitle. So we begin by clarifying the meaning of the word Dhammaduta. Sometimes I've seen that word translated as missionary, but I might find myself to be somewhat averse to this designation, since it conjures up images, mental images of the Christian missionaries arriving in Asia and Africa to convert the natives to Christianity, not seldom forcefully. And it's not the aim of a Dhammaduta to, quote, convert people to Buddhism. Our aim is not to increase the number of people calling themselves Buddhists, and a mere nominal embrace of Buddhism is not the purpose for bringing the Dhamma to the West. The word duta literally means a message. And so a Dhammaduta is a messenger of the Dhamma, one who brings the message of the Buddha's teaching to others. And theoretically, I would say that our aim in conveying the message of the Dhamma should be the same as that expressed by the Buddha when he gave his command to the first 60 Arahat disciples, telling them to travel, to wander in the world for the welfare of the many, for the happiness of the many, out of compassion for the world, and to teach the Dhamma that's good in the beginning, the middle, and the end. And so the aim of the Dhammaduta is to benefit others with the message of the Dhamma, to lead people to understand the true nature of things as revealed in the Buddha's teaching, and to undertake practices that will lead to their genuine well-being and happiness, and ultimately to complete liberation from dukkha. However, now we come to the second part of that title, and that is the Western environment, which is a bit now problematic today, because what is meant by the Western environment has become quite a complex tapestry made up of people from a wide range of backgrounds. Earlier, when we spoke about bringing the Dhamma to the West, and I think particularly here of the United States, we would think primarily of white people of European origins. And in the early days of the transmission of Buddhism to the West, these were the primary new converts to the Dhamma. But given the history of Western countries and present immigration policies, the demographics of the West have become extremely complex and diverse. So roughly speaking, I would posit 4 groups in the West as potential recipients of the Dhamma. And though I classify them separately, inevitably they intersect and overlap in various ways. And each group is in turn complex, including people with different needs and interests. And so this calls for a very highly varied way of presenting the Dhamma to meet all of these different interests and needs. So sometimes we say that no size fits all, or different strokes for different folks. So what are these 4 primary groups that constitute the potential recipients of the Dhamma in the West? So one will consist of those Westerners of European background who are usually classed as white, who might be fairly well educated and come from affluent or middle-class backgrounds. People in this group are likely to be fairly well read in Buddhism, to approach the Dhamma largely through a psychological lens, and to be initially drawn to Buddhism through its meditation practices. This would be the group in the West that first came to Buddhist practice during the 1960s and 1970s, and still dominates the Western Buddhist scene today, primarily in the upper echelon of Dharma teachers of Western origins. But then we come to the second group, because not all Westerners involved with Buddhism today are white with European roots, but increasingly we find Westerners with diverse racial identities being drawn to the Dharma. Here in the US, this includes people, Black and Latino people, as well as Asians from non-Buddhist backgrounds who have discovered Buddhism as a meaningful way of life. Already people from these backgrounds have formed their own Buddhist groups. Sometimes they're here in the US what they call people of color retreats. And some people of color have already emerged as Buddhist teachers and scholars. A few of the major Buddhist meditation centers in the US are in fact making deliberate efforts to cultivate people of color as Dhamma teachers in order to have a more diverse array of teachers who are able to present different perspectives on the Dharma, perspectives that are largely governed by their own ethnic backgrounds. Okay, then we come to the third group. So this is still another field for Dhammaduta activity in the West, are Asians from traditional Buddhist backgrounds whose interest in the Dhamma was first awakened only after they migrated to the West, where they encountered Buddhism as a living practice. In their home countries in Asia, maybe Sri Lanka, Taiwan, Malaysia, Thailand, whatever, they might have considered themselves temple Buddhists. They participate in traditional Buddhist activities as part of their cultural identity, but their Buddhist commitment pretty much ends there. But after migrating to the West, then they discover the true value of the Dhamma for their own life, their own inner development, and start to pursue it as a path of wisdom and spiritual cultivation. And many of my own students, I would say, fit into this category, many coming from Taiwan, Malaysia, Sri Lanka. Okay, then the fourth group complicates this picture still further. Here we have the children or even the grandchildren of Asian Buddhist immigrants who might have grown up sort of immersed in a purely secular way of life as youths, but then once they reach their adult years, they discover the Dhamma as a path with personal relevance. People in this category weave together features of all three of the previous categories. They might share the intellectual interests of the white convert Buddhists. They have a sense of distinct ethnic identity, which they share with the non-white American or Western Buddhists. Then coming from a traditional Buddhist background, they share similarities with traditional Buddhists who discovered the Dhamma after coming to the West, but their ways of thinking are still much closer to native-born Westerners than to their parents. So given this vast diversity of potential recipients of the Dhamma, a skillful Dhammaduta faces the challenge of how to modulate the Buddha's teachings to meet their different needs. They'll have to know their audience and be skilled in delivering the message of the Dhamma in the appropriate way. Okay, now I come to the question, what is the message of the Dhamma that is to be delivered? And here I'm not just going to go through the standard list of classical Buddhist teachings, but rather what I want to bring out is that today we find certain complex challenges that were not faced by the earliest Dhammadutas, the direct disciples of the Buddha, who saw their task as simply to convey the Buddha's message as they heard it from his own mouth and as they had realized it in their own experience. We now live in a very different era, but even before Buddhism, even before we reached the modern age, Buddhism had already splintered into a variety of schools and systems, each with its own distinctive take on the teachings, with its own methods of practice and points of emphasis. But here, since I'm speaking to the members of the Theravada Sangha Association, I'll consider only the approaches grounded in the Theravada tradition. But even this matter is not so simple. As I kind of survey the manifestations of Buddhism appearing here in the United States, I found at least three distinct, but again, interwoven ways in which Buddhism is being expressed and expounded. And for convenience, I call these three modes traditional Buddhism, secular Buddhism. Those two categories are already pretty well established. But then I found a third strain that I call immanent Buddhism. Immanent in the sense of being involved with this world, not immanent in the sense of what lies just beyond the horizon in the future. Though maybe the immanent Buddhists will also think of themselves as the immanent Buddhists in the sense that they think their form of Buddhism will eventually prevail in the future. Okay, the primary difference between these different approaches stems from the different perspectives on the fundamental Buddhist teachings. Traditional Buddhism sees human life as embedded in samsara, literally the round of rebirths, which is without beginning and comprises many different planes of existence, including various hells and heavens. Okay, from this standpoint, human beings, that is we ourselves, move from life to life through these different realms in accordance with our karma, our volitional deeds, which is taken in the traditional way as a force with the capacity to determine the modes of rebirth and our destiny from life to life. Life in all of these different realms of existence is seen as impermanent, as subject to dukkha, different aspects of suffering or unsatisfactoriness. And from this perspective, the ultimate aim in following the Buddha's path is to attain nibbana, which is understood not merely as a state of sublime peace and inner freedom, but as an unconditioned dimension where we find total release from the round of rebirths. The aims of those who practice the Dhamma in the traditionalist mode vary, vary in accordance with their degrees of spiritual maturity. Those with the sharpest faculties might aspire to win the bliss of Nibbana in this life itself, but most practitioners, or those who have a fairly realistic assessment of themselves, see themselves as embarking on a long journey towards the final goal and hope to make gradual progress from life to life by practicing the Dhamma in the ways that best accord with their capacities. But despite these differences and aspirations, the classical framework of traditional Buddhism remains consistent. It's the ideas of rebirth occurring through different realms of existence, karma as a moral force with consequences for our future lives, and Nibbana as a state of transcendent liberation to be won by practicing the noble path of Sila, Samadhi, and Panya, virtuous conduct, meditative concentration, and insight wisdom. And it's against this background that the Four Noble Truths, the central Buddhist doctrine, acquire their fullest and deepest meaning. Starting perhaps late 1970s, early 1980s, there emerged an approach to the Dhamma which came to be called secular Buddhism. And interestingly, this kind of secular Buddhism arose within the fold of the Theravada school, perhaps because the teachings in the Pali Suttas have a somewhat secular flavor. They have a pragmatic purpose, they make strong appeals to direct experience, and they deal with many aspects of everyday life. But in contrast to traditional Theravada Buddhism, secular Buddhism rejects beliefs about past and future lives. It does not accept the idea of rebirth as the underpinning of Buddhist practice, but claims to be concerned solely with our immediate existential situation in this life itself. It also aims at liberation from suffering, but it sees this liberation not as release from the round of birth and death, but as a relative freedom of mind from the grip of the defilements, to be achieved by Buddhist practice. Secular Buddhism, of course, has been popularized by the work of Stephen Batchelor, but not all secular Buddhists are Batchelorite Buddhists. Many secular Buddhists reject Stephen's drastic reinterpretations of the Dhamma and remain quite faithful to the basic teachings of the Pali Canon insofar as they pertain to life within this world itself. Okay, the third flavor of Theravada of Buddhism derived from the Theravada school is what I have designated immanent Buddhism. And by this term, I refer to an approach to the Dhamma that avoids doctrinal issues to focus almost entirely on pragmatic and psychological aims. While secular Buddhists explicitly and sometimes rigorously reject traditional Buddhist beliefs, most Westerners who adopt the Dharma in the immanent mode simply treat these beliefs as irrelevant. They draw from the canonical text whatever teachings serve their purpose, often quoting the text selectively with little concern for context. Many will blend Buddhist meditation with techniques derived from more humanistic models of psychotherapy, and sometimes with other spiritual teachings. And so what's interesting is that the focus on immanent concerns that I've been able to detect is most apparent in the Western offshoot of the Theravada tradition, commonly called Vipassana Buddhism, because it takes Vipassana meditation as its primary mode of practice. But while it follows sometimes strictly this form of meditation coming down from Asia, it reconfigures insight meditation in ways largely governed by the psychological aspiration for wholeness and inner healing that prevails among educated and fairly affluent Westerners. Okay, now I call this part of my talk, delivering the message. Okay, now that I've sketched these three flavors or modalities of the Dhamma that are circulating today, I want to bring up the question, which one should we as Dhammadutas be propagating? And as Theravada Buddhist monastics, we have a primary obligation to be faithful to the Buddha's teachings as these have been preserved in the texts of the Pali Canon, a primary source, and thus we would strongly incline to a traditionalist perspective on the Dhamma. If we put aside these teachings in order to become relevant to people in the West today, or we try to make the Dhamma congenial, going out of our way to make the Dhamma congenial to critical scientific ways of thought, we risk diluting and distorting the teachings, sometimes in very subtle ways. And we might think that just making a few minor modifications to the teaching or introducing shifts in emphasis might entail no harm, but as the Dharma passes from one generation to the next, it's possible that these modifications will tend to increase like a snowball, becoming more and more prominent until we are left with just the empty shell of Buddhism. It's clear that the Buddha taught such principles as karma and rebirth, and taught them on the basis of his own experience. It's also true that he held up as the final aim of his teaching, not merely the ability to flow along mindfully in the present, to dwell happily in the here and now, but he held up as the goal a state of world transcending liberation, the unconditioned, the deathless, nibbana. However, while I see it's necessary to preserve and promote the classical principles of the Dhamma, I also believe we have to be ready to adapt the horizons of the traditional Buddhist teaching to the horizons of understanding distinctive of our own time. That is, it has to be, to use a philosophical expression, a kind of fusion of horizons in our presentation of the Dhamma. And so I would say, within a broad traditionalist framework, to deliver the message of the Dhamma in ways that are meaningful and relevant, we should be ready to adopt a strongly immanent or even a secular orientation, but without discarding the traditionalist framework. And this was often, we could say, the Buddha's own approach as we find it in the suttas. He often will lead his listeners through successive stages. He'll begin by demonstrating the value of basic Dhamma teachings to their lives here and now, and then gradually he'll guide them to an appreciation and then a realization of the ultimate goal. So how does this actually work out in practice? How do we present the Dhamma in ways that are faithful to its original framework and purpose, yet applicable to the critical needs of our time? I would approach this question by noting that the guiding aim of the Dhamma is to provide a solution to the problem of suffering. And so I would then raise the question, what are the particular types of suffering that are distinctive of our own time? And how can we as Buddhist Dhammadutas address these types of suffering in ways that are both faithful to the tradition, yet pragmatically meaningful and effective? And so I want to highlight 3 particular types of suffering distinctive of the present age, and then briefly discuss how we might express the Dhamma in order to deal with them effectively and meaningfully. Okay, so the first distinctive type of suffering, or type of suffering distinctive of our own era, is what I would call a pervasive sense of meaninglessness. This is especially prevalent here in the West, but it has spread to other parts of the world that have come under Western influence, including many of the traditional Buddhist countries. And it seems that this pervasive sense of meaninglessness, or kind of inner emptiness, set in with the beginning of the modern era, stemming from the collapse of the familiar world picture of traditional Western culture, a world picture that gave meaning and a clearly defined place to each person's life. So when all guideposts were torn away, sensitive people find themselves floating in a kind of metaphysical void. They find themselves to be empty individual egos pitted against one another in a brute competition for domination and control. And as a way of relief, many seek escape routes through mind-numbing entertainment, junk food, easy casual sex, alcohol, and drugs. Others react by turning back to a kind of fierce, dogmatic, almost violent adherence to fundamentalist religion, which has become very prominent right here in the United States, where it's often driven by hatred against the secular liberals who they consider responsible for undermining their familiar, accustomed source of meaning and value. We see that the number of people with psychological disorders multiply, people suffering from stress, depression, anxiety, feelings of inner worthlessness. But some, seeking an outlet, turn to the great spiritual traditions that are still brimming with life. And this, I think, is where Buddhism, or the Dhamma, becomes especially attractive, because it's intellectually solid, appealing to personal experience, personal verification for confirmation. It's pragmatic, offering ways of practice that can be applied in everyday life, and it's transformative. It brings uplifting changes in the quality of life. It leads to deeper self-understanding and release from the grip of destructive emotions. But the approach to be taken in presenting Buddhist teachings may have to differ from the traditional approach. In the traditional approach, as we find it in Asian Buddhist tradition, one begins by emphasizing the need for faith and devotion, and probably the greatest number of practices in traditional Buddhism are devotional practices, recitation, prostrations, Bodhi pujas, and so forth. Then one moves in the traditional approach from faith to such basic virtues as dana and sila, giving and moral discipline. And then one expects practices like meditation and insight to be taken up later. But in the present day, generally we've tended to emphasize meditation as the door of entry to the Dhamma, even for those without solid moral foundations. And so when Dhamma teachers started to come who had been trained in Asia, I'm thinking of the early pioneers of insight meditation when they came from Asia back to the West, to the US, the way they propagated the Dhamma was through intensive long-term meditation retreats, even for people who had no knowledge of Buddhist teachings, no familiarity with the basic practices. I'm getting a little phlegm in my lung. Let me just take a sucking candy. Yeah, and I remember even my first year or two as a monk in Sri Lanka, where the emphasis was on intensive meditation. And whenever we Western monks would meet, we would sort of be looking each other in the eye, thinking, has he got it yet? Has he reached stream entry yet? And now when I look back at us at those days, I could see there was a bit arrogant of us to be expecting to reach these high levels of attainment in such a short time. So even though we might, as a kind of skillful means, emphasize meditation as a door of entrance to the Dhamma, it should be seen just as a stepping stone for once people start to take up intensive meditation without solid foundations, they'll start to realize just how little they really know themselves, how little control they have over their own minds, to what extent they're the victims of their own restless thoughts and wild emotions. And this might have a humbling effect, opening people up to faith and making them realize the need to go back to square one, to start with the more fundamental practices, especially dana and sila, giving and virtuous conduct. But at the same time, when one starts with meditation practice, this can awaken an interest in the theoretical basis of Buddhist meditation, that is, in the philosophy and psychology of Buddhism, and then lead people to the study of the primary Buddhist texts, especially the Nikayas, the suttas. Okay, now a second aspect that I want to deal with, the delivering the message of the Dhamma. And again, this follows from what I've just covered. And this is what I would call a renewed emphasis on the ethics of Buddhism. In the West, traditional ethics drew its strength from the belief that morality was rooted in the decrees of an all-powerful creator God, a God who defines certain courses of action as good, others as bad, and who encourages people to do good and to avoid the bad. But when belief in God diminishes, then for many, morality loses its bedrock. I think it was Nietzsche who said, when God is dead, everything is permitted. And this brings a kind of suffering along with it the suffering of not knowing how to behave properly, the suffering of a yearning for a, maybe call this an ontological foundation for right conduct, so that choosing the good over the bad is not just a matter of subjective opinion, but that ethics is grounded in the very texture or nature of the cosmos. And so this is what we find in traditional Buddhism, where ethical values are connected to the ideas of karma and rebirth. And of course, these ideas of karma and rebirth were taught by the Buddha, and I'm fully convinced of their validity. But the question that comes to my mind is whether sort of expounding them at the outset is the most effective way to begin teaching the basics of morality today. The problem we face is that the ideas of karma and rebirth lie outside the range of an ordinary person's direct experience. And so while they are a critical part of right view, if we connect ethics to these teachings of karma and rebirth, then it makes the ground of ethics lie outside personal experience. So I think what we need is what I would call a more directly visible approach to the grounding of ethics. And so what I would emphasize is the direct connection between one's conduct and one's state of mind. So instead of trying to intimidate a person to avoid evil with the fear of bad rebirth, or convince a person to do good with the promise of a happy rebirth, I would ask people to consider the impact of their actions on their own mind and character. And the Buddha himself often used this approach, asking people to see how unwholesome conduct brings inner turmoil and distress, while wholesome conduct brings inner tranquility and happiness. And when we start from that basis, then we can more easily project into the future and understand how these same types of conduct have an impact that lies beyond the present life, that they can lead respectively to miserable or happy states of rebirth, and that good conduct can lead ultimately to final liberation. Okay, now I come to a third point in the delivering of the message of the Dhamma today. And this might be a bit controversial, especially in relation to Theravada monasticism. Since over the centuries, the ideal image of the Theravadan monk is one of a cool detachment from social concerns. The ideal monk is one who is able to look upon the rising and falling waves of worldly events from a standpoint of calm equanimity. But here in the West, and I think particularly in the United States, we have a model of the religious leader, a spiritual leader, as one who is able to speak up openly, clearly, decisively from a moral point of view on issues with social and economic and political implications. And so today, we find that social and economic injustice, glaring poverty, environmental destruction, racism, prejudice, and so forth have become some of the most important causes of collective suffering in our time. And I don't think as messengers of the Dhamma that we could turn away from this aspect of our present condition. The Buddha, in pursuing his own path to liberation, left the home life and stepped out of the rigid caste structure of Indian society. But once he attained enlightenment, standing outside the established social order, he was able to look back at it critically, quite acutely, and to describe the characteristics of a just, healthy, benevolent society. He created the image of the ideal ruler as the wheel-turning monarch, one who rules under the dominion of Dhamma, understood as the law of righteousness and truth, the law of justice. And the task of the wheel-turning monarch is to bring Dhamma as justice and righteousness into the world. In our own time, we don't have wheel-turning monarchs, but we have more or less democratic systems of government. And so it's the responsibility of people to implement justice and righteousness in the world. And I think it's part of our own task as monastics to guide people in promoting the right kinds of policies, laws, and practices that will help justice to prevail in the world, that will shine the light of injustice and speak up on behalf of those victims of social, economic, and political injustice who cannot speak for themselves. It's certainly not the role of monastics to become politically active by running for office, endorsing candidates, campaigning for candidates, and so forth. But still, I think we have to distinguish between right and wrong, good and bad policies, between policies that are likely to promote the well-being, safety, and prosperity of people, and policies that are likely to bring harm and suffering for many. And then at least some Dhammadutas, those who have an interest in these matters and an ability to understand these rather complex issues, should be ready to speak up and advocate on behalf of justice and particularly environmental, ecological sanity. Okay, so maybe this will do for some of my reflections on the task of a Dhammaduta in today's world, particularly in bringing the message of the Dhamma to the West. So I thank you all for your attention and hope we'll have a fruitful discussion afterwards.
Joy, I will, on behalf of the group, express my own sadhu, as a choosing to voice for the 160 people that are participating at this time. So thank you very much indeed for those very comprehensive and well-defined and insightful reflections. We'll now have a panel discussion involving four of the leaders of Theravada communities here in the UK. These four Venerable Lumpur Khemadhammo of the Forest Hermitage in Warwickshire, who is, I think, the most senior monastic gathered together in this event today. So he was a disciple of Venerable Ajahn Chah, and this is his 50th Vasa, 50th reigns, I believe, Lumpur Khemadhammo. And also Bhante Sīlavimala, who is the abbot of the London Buddhist Vihara, which was the very first Buddhist monastery to be established here in the UK in 1926 by Anagarika Dhammapala. And so Venerable Sīlavimala, the abbot of the London Buddhist Vihara and from a Sri Lankan background. Also, we have Venerable Dr. Dhammasamī, who is born in the Shan state in Myanmar and is a resident abbot, and the abbot of the Oxford Buddha Vihara, resident in this country most of the time. He's in Shan state at the moment, but generally based in the UK. He has a doctorate from Oxford University, which is no mean feat for anybody. He's a DPhil from Oxford, and also he is a fellow of the Oxford Centre for Buddhist Studies. And then lastly, Venerable Phra Mahā Bhatsakorn, who has taken a massive range of responsibilities at Wat Buddha Badipa, the abbot of Wat Buddha is very elderly now, and I believe has been in Thailand for some time. But Venerable Mahā Bhatsakorn has been extremely diligent and active in the Thai community in this country, and so he'll be the fourth of the panel members. So I'll call upon each of them to speak for a couple of minutes on particular points of Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi's presentation, and then so speak for a couple of minutes each, and then open up a discussion between the four of them. So there was so much in Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi's talk, so it's difficult to know what to pick up first of all. But perhaps Lumpur Khemadhammo as the first speaker, and particularly with your background, having been in this country since 1977 as a bhikkhu, and particularly involved with prison chaplaincy, could you offer some reflections on this particular point that Bhikkhu Bodhi made about sort of delivering the message in an appropriate voice in the environment of, say, the prison chaplaincy movement, and to many of the people who don't have a Buddhist background, or don't have a kind of ground in traditional Buddhist beliefs, but delivering a message in a way that is effective and transformative. And also anything else from Bhikkhu Bodhi's talk you'd like to pick up on, please feel most welcome to.
Thank you. Well, I was struck by his early comments about the complexity of the society here in the West, because of course it's changed immensely in my lifetime. And when I went to Thailand in 1971, this was a very different country from what it is now. And it's a much more complex pattern that we see of people here, and of people coming to Buddhism. And I appreciate what he said too about the young people from traditional Buddhist countries like Thailand, who before they came here had no interest in Buddhism, but having come here have suddenly discovered a living Buddhism. I've had that experience with students at Warwick University. I've taught the Buddhist Society at Warwick University for 20 years, and that's been an experience there with them, with these young people. In the prisons, well, you know, we have a variety of people, mostly very talented people, often, of course, not applying their talents in the most skillful directions, but still, nevertheless, some very interesting people. But in the prisons, it's very easy to teach Buddhism because they understand suffering immediately, whereas the average middle-class English person really doesn't quite get it. I often tell this story that when Ajahn Chah was here, when we came to England in 1977, I took him to visit my parents, and we went to call one afternoon on my cousin, a rather distant cousin, not someone I knew very well, but someone who was very prosperous. And it was time for afternoon tea. So he and I were at one end of the room, sitting on the sofa, and the rest of the gathering were at the other end, around the tea table. And the teacups were clattering, and the CD cake was being passed, and all the rest of it. And eventually he nudged me in the ribs, Lumpur Cha nudged me in the ribs and said to me to ask them if they suffer. Well, it didn't seem to me quite the right occasion to talk about suffering, so I was just about to sort of make my excuses and get out of it, and the room went absolutely silent, and the teacups were poised, and they were all hanging on what he had said, you see, and I was trapped. So I had to say to them, well, he wants to know if you suffer. Well, they giggled a bit, and in the end, I just had to say to Lumpur Cha, you're my kajai, they don't understand. And that was it. And that is how it is for many people who are very, reasonably well off and comfortable. But people in prison of course, have had a great deal taken away from them. Whatever they may have done, they have suffered and continue to do so as well. When you've lost your liberty, it's not a very nice thing. So it's quite, well, it's not difficult. It's also, of course, not difficult to draw attention to why they suffer. You know, often they want to be somewhere else. I mean, where they are isn't too bad. The roof doesn't generally leak. There's heat and there's food, but there's the desire to be somewhere else. There is discontent. So it's not so difficult to teach people in prison. But yes, certainly you have to pay attention. It's one of the great things I learned from Luang Por Chah, watching him at his kuti. You know, he'd sit there listening patiently to people bringing all their kinds of rubbish and gossip and complaining about their wives and husbands and so on. And he'd sit and listen. And then when there was an opportunity, they mentioned something was said about their experience, bang, he was in, like a master swordsman, and teaching them a living Dhamma. So I think this is a very important point to really strike at what is meaningful to people. And that, of course, isn't very easy. And for people, for monks coming from the West, to learn that skill here monks coming from the East, to learn that skill here in the West is I think, somewhat daunting.
Boy, if I can draw your comments to a close there. Thank you very much for that. Before I welcome Venerable Sīlavimala to speak, should I say to the participants, if you have questions that have come up or that anything that comes to mind you want to ask about, please do type that into the chat box, send that to Dr. Santong or Yom Kamontip in the chat box. And so when we come to the questions and answer part of the session this afternoon, then we'll be ready to address those. So feel free to be sort of typing as you listen and entering some questions in the chat box. So Venerable Dhammasamī, you're in a somewhat unique position, having one foot in a very ancient university in England and one foot in a extreme, hardly newly formed university in Shan State, and very different groups of people that you are interfacing with and challenged to, say, meet these various different aspects of delivering the message. Have you got any particular reflections in mind from Bhikkhu Bodhi's talk?
Thank you, Venerable Sis. I just would like to bring up one thing from my experiences in England. I'm connected to the Sri Lankan families, Thai families, and Burmese families in the UK. But this is particularly from, this is the voice of the Burmese people either born or bred in the UK. A group that the Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi has singled out as the fourth group. Usually in America and also in Europe, the Burmese viharas, they still follow the traditional way. Many of them medical professionals and others. So they would have a chance to meet the monks mainly during the weekends, and they would invite the monks to their home. People would bring food, so they share food, and they do some recitation, a bit of meditation. But mainly the monks would be speaking in Burmese. This is not just the proper languages, but here what the young people were saying is that, look, it's not a proper food fair. You bring a lot of food, but it's not a proper food fair. We can't really enjoy it that way. And it's not a proper lecture. because you're not prepared that way. And it's not a proper meditation session either, but that's the main meeting point of the community. This is true in the Sri Lankan community and also in the Thai community. So I just would like to bring up this point and how we should be mindful of the categories raised by our keynote speakers today. But one thing that the most venerable has raised, and I would like to emphasize here very briefly, is that in the training, in the Dhammaduta training, because I also give some lectures to Thai Dhammaduta in Thailand and also in Myanmar, the need for listening before we speak, the need to listen to the community, we bring the Dhamma. By listening, we actually come to realize where to adapt. But this listening skill or listening training is not probably constituted in the Dhammaduta trainings. I just would like to make this point. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much indeed, Venerable Dhammasamī. Those are extremely insightful and thoughtful comments, and particularly those last 2 points about including listening, the art of listening in Dhammaduta training, to, in a sense, tune into the group that one is meeting, which of those different strata, those different, members of different groups that you're talking with, and also the modes of gathering. I thought it was interesting to see that say it's not a real food fair, it's not a real lecture, it's not a real meditation session, and so I felt that was a very good illustration of one of the points that Bhikkhu Bodhi was making. So Bhante Sīlavimala, were there particular points of Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi's presentation that you were struck by, or in particular, I mean, you've been in London teaching, and not just the Sri Lankan community, but largely the community of the kind of immigrant Sri Lankan community. Also, that group of young Asian people, I think Lumpur Khemadhammo referred to some of his students from Warwick, people who've grown up in families of Asian ancestry, but have been born here in the West, in the UK, and working in that environment. How have you, found that interfacing or expressing Dhamma teachings to that kind of group, that demographic of people being born from Asian parents but growing up in a Western environment? The challenges of communicating and feeding their interest in Dhamma and helping that ending of suffering to be more directly realized. Please, Bhante, offer 2 or 3 minutes of your reflections to be very helpful. And then after that, we'll have some time for a sort of four-way conversation between all of our venerable panelists for 10 minutes or so. So please, Bhante, offer your respects.
Thank you so much. As so far we have discussed, is important, very meaningful for us as Dhammaduta monks. I was appointed as a Dhammaduta monk by the Anagarika Dhammapala Trust in Sri Lanka. Actually, this is the first Buddhist monastery founded by Anagarika. At the very beginning, I had very hard time because although all the English classes I have followed, the English accent in UK is very different. So therefore, I had to undergo so much troubles. What I try for one class, I had to get prepared for 2 weeks actually to take one class. Such a hard time I had at the very beginning. That time, Venerable most Venerable, our previous predecessors, Venerable Sati Thero and Venerable Jitanyana Thero, they have taught the students. Then I had a very, very hard time, so much taking word by word from the lessons and taught me how to teach the Dhamma. I am very much grateful to him. Once Buddhist Society invited me as a teacher in the summer school. Then I was selected. Mahaparinibbana Sutta, Venerable Dr. Rahul had taken sentence by sentence and helped me to teach the Dhamma. In here actually, as mentioned, I have attended. Majority are actually Western people. I also attended to hospitals as chaplain, also to understood she was concerned about confession. But in Buddhism, there is no confession. But I understood.
We're having troubles with the audio, and also the screen is, my screen is freezing with Bhante Sīlavimala's connection from London Buddhist Vihara. So perhaps because time is limited, with apologies, perhaps we can, if you can hear this, Bhante Sīlavimala, please, if you can maybe just end your comments there, and then if we can open up the floor to Lompo Khemadhammo, Venerable Dr. Dhammasamī, after Venerable Mahā Bhatsakorn has spoken. I think if Bhante Sīlavimala's connection can be improved, then we can add that on again. But I think if Phra Mahā, if you'd like to speak now, and then for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we can open up the dialogue between, or the trialogue between the three of you, and hopefully that connection with London Buddhist Vihara will improve. But if it doesn't, then just the conversation between the three venerables will need to be sufficient. So please, Phra Mahā Bhatsakorn, please offer your reflections on the theme on Bhikkhu Bodhi today.
Okay, dear all venerable monks and dear devotees. Well, in my situation, I thought I didn't expect to be a Dhammaduta. I became a Dhammaduta by accident. The reason why I said that, because when I was living at Wat Matan in Bangkok, and then I was asked by someone to help with the IBMC, International Buddhist Meditation Center. And because at that time I was learning English, and then I liked to practice my English with Western tourists. And from my experience, after I have been living in the UK since 2006, I could say a few points that when I first came here, my impression with English people was not good. The reason was that when I went for a walk, when I walked to the town, whenever I got lost, when I asked local people, I simply say, "Excuse me," even just before I asked them the question, they just walk away, just said, no, just walk away. Well, I didn't understand why this happened until I went to ask my supervisor, and why this happened to me. And this seemed that the people here were so mean. I simply want to ask them for the direction. They just walk away. They said, no. And then my supervisor said, "It is because of your role. Okay, next time when you ask for the direction, don't stop. Just say, 'Excuse me, how can they get to the bus stop? How can they get to the coach station or whatever?'" So I understand why they walk away from me, because of my role, and because they were afraid that I might try to convert them to my religion. And later on, from my experience, I feel that there are many people out there who need our help, because they couldn't find the answer from even from the counselor or from their religion. So as a Dhammaduta monk in England, I think we could do a lot. And if we can improve our language skill, but for the Thai community, we still have very limited numbers of monks of Thai monks who speak good English. That's our main problem. But being a good example is not the way. I can take Luang Por Chah as an example. Although he couldn't speak English, But as we say that he had many Western students, many Western disciples all over the world, and all of them work very successfully. So here's just a few points that I just would like to make. Thank you.
So we're running a little bit over time, but thank you very much for your reflections, Venerable. So perhaps Venerable Lumpur Khemadhammo, Venerable Dr. Dhammasamī, and Venerable Mahā Bhatsakorn, if you'd like to have, say, 10 minutes of conversation between the three of you, and ideally, if Bhante Sīlavimala can join in, then very good. But just to say, if there's any things that you've heard from each other or other points you'd like to make with respect to Bhikkhu Bodhi's comments, then please feel free to have 10 minutes now. It's 18 minutes past 3 on my clock here in the UK. So maybe if we can finish this conversation by 3:30 and then carry on to the next part of with the questions and answer after that. So please feel free, Lumpur Khemadhammo and others, to engage with each other.
I'd like to really echo what Mahā Bhatsakorn said about the importance of the language, learning the language, being able to communicate well. And I think also I'd like to add that taking an interest in the traditions and customs of the countries that you're going to. Because I've noticed, I'm afraid, that with some of the monks coming from overseas, they've not really understood that. There was one notable example, a monk who came and lived here about 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And he was really quite fascinated by the traditions of this country. And it made an enormous difference. If you go somewhere, like, of course, many English people do, and you want to just live as you did at home, then it's really rather boring for a start. And secondly, you are not in a very good position to communicate. And communication for Dhammadutas is very important, to be able to communicate. So I would encourage monks who come here to really take an interest in the language and in the customs and traditions of this country. Yeah.
Thank you, Lumpur. I also would like to second what you have just said, but to actually make a real impact, we need to engage with the trainers, the organizers, the programmers, and different Dhammaduta schools. Maybe, if we don't get it in this decade, maybe the next decade we will have the kind of monks with sufficient understanding and relevant message that we have just been talking about and highlighted today. And it's not very difficult to practice that, because in my experience working with international school kids in Bangkok and in Rangoon, their mindset is exactly like the people in England, especially the second generation Asian people born and bred, the fourth group that the most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi has highlighted. So if as a Theravada Sangha, if we can give some practical help, suggestion and help, okay, to the training institutes, this would be a good start. I would say. Not only that, we also we'll be helping the monks themselves back home in Buddhist countries to connect with international school graduates who are going to rule their country. An important point that I think. Thank you.
Any further points? Anything you'd like to add, Venerable Mahā Bhatsakorn, say in response to these particular comments, or anything further with respect to Bhikkhu Bodhi's say presentation? I thought particularly the last thing that Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi said about the so quote unquote perhaps controversial point of the Sangha members in the West being more ready to speak up on particularly impactful issues, and he gave the example of the environment specifically, but it's much broader than that. And so, if there's any of the three of you venerables have any comments, particularly about that sense of the time demands us to, or invites us to step up and give more of a public voice, public expression to these kind of issues. And I felt that the point that the Buddha's establishing of the wheel-turning monarch as a sort of a moral example and example of skillful living and skillful leadership was very very relevant. So do any of the three of you have any particular comments with that respect, a sort of invitation to step up and be more of a public voice, not running for parliament, you know, heaven forfend, as they say, but being ready to give more of a clear voice in the public arena to express Buddhist values, to give a kind of clear, wholesome and moral guidance to the broader community?
Well, I just would like to say a few words that because I grew up in Thai Sangha community, in the environment in Thailand. So although I would like to express myself in public, but in some way that could bring you a big trouble. So that could be the main reason why that many monks do not want to speak their voice, because they're afraid that that might be in a big trouble. But to me, to express the moral standard, like what is right, what's wrong, we need to stick to the Buddhist teaching. And for example, if something is not right in the community, or if the public needs the answer from the religious leader, as the Dhammaduta, we need to be brave enough to speak out, and so that the people could hear us. But in the past, the monks simply would like to be silent, because being silent won't bring you trouble. And if you speak out, it can bring about problem to yourself. So this is what happened in the past. And I think many monks now choose to be silent rather than to speak out. Thank you.
I think it's not just a lot of monks choose not to speak up. I think a lot of people these days are rather reluctant to say too much, because it brings trouble, and they find themselves being criticized for their views. But I think it is important, if somehow we can express it in terms of the Dharma and what the Buddha had to say about certain principles. I mean, it does worry me that we live increasingly here in Britain anyway, in an unprincipled society, it seems to me. The arguments over Brexit, for example, were all about, or nearly all that I heard, about greed, how much you were going to get, how much more prosperous, how much, that sort of thing, and very little in terms of principles. And that did concern me. And I think we have to draw attention to that we're not a very principled society, and not a very respectful one either. That's another point that I notice as I get older, as young people have little regard for older people. That's a sad thing to say, but it's true.
Thank you very much, Lumpur. Thank you. Venerable Dhammasamī, maybe a last comment from you on this this point, and then we'll move on to the Q&A period.
Thank you, Lumpur. I think I agree with Bhikkhu Bodhi on the need to speak out on relevant issues, burning issues, important issues. to the global community like this. But how to do that is a question. And just as the most venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi asked a question, if talking about karma at the beginning is the most appropriate way to Westerners. So here we should ask the question how we do that. I don't have any definite answer now, but listening to Venerable Phra Mahā Bhatsakorn, why many monks choose or have chosen safety first. I think there's another way of doing it. Like Venerable Buddhist, he has written on different issues, and he is not controversial. He has not drawn troubles to himself, because of the way he speaks, he writes. In addition to that, I think we also need to raise a lot of awareness on social injustice, all those things among the Sangha, especially Dhammaduta. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for all of you. I'm very sorry that Bhante Sīlavimala wasn't able to join in the more of the discussion, but this is one of the, it's quite miraculous to me that we can all communicate around the country, around the world, on several different continents, and have a virtual gathering of this nature, but not everything is under personal control. Sabbe Sankara Anicca, and Sabbe Dhamma Anatta. So sorry that the Venerable Sīlavimala was not able to participate in that. So a number of questions have been sent in. What we've thought to do is I will read out the questions. There's about 12 or 15 questions come in, and I think we've got about a quarter of an hour for this. So what I'll do is I'll read out the questions, and then perhaps particularly Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, if we give you sort of what we call in England first dibs. First dibs, and then if you say, oh, I'd like to invite one of the other venerables to speak to this, then that seems to be a good way forward. We all wanted to give you as much of the floor as was possible, since you are our kind of our main speaker and our most distinguished participant.
I think I came across that expression, first dibs, in a British movie, and then I had to look it up on Google.
Yeah, Wikipedia is very good for those kind of things. So, first one, how do you prepare your audience if it's unfamiliar or resistant to the point of hostility towards Buddha's teachings and Vipassana meditation as practiced in Theravada Buddhism? Must you deny your teachings as Dhamma and present it in a secular form in order for it to be palatable to, say, strong Christians or Muslims, or I would add in materialists? How do you reassure those of the Abrahamic faiths, like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, that you are sharing, not to proselytize, not to convert, but rather to inform? So, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, would you like to respond to that?
I don't actually have so much experience in that area, because usually when I'm giving talks or classes, the people who come to the talks or classes are already either Buddhist, already Buddhist, or interested in Buddhism. So I don't have experience confronting what you might call hostile audience.
In the UK, there's quite a close connection between schools and and Buddhist monasteries and churches and mosques and Hindu temples and so forth, because religious education is a requirement. So often, my experience has been, and maybe all of the venerables here have been in that situation where you're invited into a school, or a group of school children come to you, or university students are sort of brought as a group, and some of them are there under duress, or they're determined to sit at 90 degrees to you as you're speaking, and looking for things to complain about. So perhaps any of the other three have comments or experience on that score. Anyone? Lumpur Khemadhammo?
Oh, well, I mean, occasionally, but I'm being a bit of a rebel myself. I'm very sympathetic to them, so it doesn't. I don't get particularly fazed by that, really.
So no particular comments from any of the others. Well, we've got a lot of questions, so let's just move on to. And I think that Bhikkhu Bodhi, you addressed that in a very articulate way in terms of, say, being faithful to the teachings, but putting things in a form that's sensitive to the group that you're with, and also the point the Venerable Dhammasamī made about listening to the people first, and then crafting the way that you speak things. Speak about.
Yeah, if it's like a multi-faith gathering with representatives of different faiths have come together in a spirit of goodwill towards each other, then there's no problem, because we just speak a straight Buddhist point of view. Somebody else will speak from a Christian point of view, a Muslim point of view, Jewish point of view. But then there's a sort of underlying mutual respect, even though we have different points of view. But that's somewhat different from confronting what the question of phrase as a hostile audience.
Very good. So the next question is, how do you mindfully respond to other Western teachers or their followers who teach wrong views of the Dhamma because they themselves have not fully understood the Dhamma? So, do you have any comments on that, Venerable?
By way of personal temperament, I like to avoid direct confrontation, but try to find some underlying common ground of understanding. And then maybe my way would be maybe to ask like a question, like somebody puts forth like a wrong understanding, but then I might say, well, in such and such a sutta, don't we find the Buddha saying this? And wouldn't there be some problem reconciling this particular statement of the Buddha with what you've said here?
Very good.
I don't like to come up and say, but sometimes if I get a little carried away, then I'll say, you're wrong.
I think you could probably have a second career as a diplomat in that respect. So next question. Anatta is the hardest concept to accept for stream entry into Nibbana. Also, I think with respect to the Western world, how do you help Westerners to cross this barrier? Or I would sort of render that differently. Yeah. How do you help Westerners to understand what the concept or the principle of anatta is about? Yeah, it's because I would also add on, say, it's so often rendered as, Buddhists believe there is no self, or the Buddha said there is no soul. So using a sort of Christian or sort of Western language, psychological language, so if there's a particular way or a form of expression to convey the principle of anatta, how would you outline that or describe that?
Yeah, myself, I wouldn't begin certainly I wouldn't begin introducing relative beginners to the Dhamma to the teaching of anatta. But what I would do is take the teaching of anatta in context in terms of its function within the framework of the Buddha's teaching. So the Buddha doesn't just come out and say, there is no self, there is no soul. But the way he teaches is that, our root problem is that of clinging to the five aggregates. And then we take the five aggregates to be permanent, to be the source of everlasting pleasure, and then to be self, to be I and mine. And then I would use like some of the perspectives that the Dhamma gives us on the five aggregates to sort of undermine the identification of the aggregates as the self. beginning with impermanence or the conditioned nature of the five aggregates, and then show how that is contradictory to what's implied by the Indian notion of Atman or self, a permanent, ever blissful, self-existent, autonomous center of experience.
Sat Chitananda.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you so much. The next question, very relevant to today's theme. As a traditional Buddhist monk, this is a monk who lives here in the UK. As a traditional Buddhist monk, if a Theravada Buddhist monk involves themselves in the current affairs of politics or social injustice, it could be acceptable in Western society, but they may be subject to criticism or minor punishments from members of their own national community or country. I've come across criticism for monks cutting grass or cooking for homeless people in the West by traditional Buddhists, including monks and lay people. What would be your comment or suggestion? I think beyond cutting grass and cooking, but I think also speaking up in terms of social injustice and.
Yeah, I think one has to do that in a sort of appropriate way, like not forcefully or vehemently denouncing the people who are guilty of injustice, and sort of not turning it into personal attacks. Though sometimes one gets tempted to go in that direction, but sort of pointing out let's say the impact on certain policies, unjust policies, on the lives of thousands or even millions of people, where, say, here in the United States, where we don't have a universal system of healthcare.
Yes.
So people who fall sick face enormous medical costs, which can just bankrupt them. And many people don't even go to see a doctor when they get sick. They just resign themselves to their illness because they can't face the costs. We have many people here in the United States, probably millions of people who are homeless. And now with the ending of the moratorium on evictions that was imposed because of the COVID pandemic, millions of people, I think I don't remember the figure, 12 million are in danger of losing their home. And, I think, and of course, in the US, we have like roughly 1 in 7 households suffers from food insecurity. I think so if we don't speak up about this and say that, we need a juster system especially of taxation, so that, and big corporations and billionaires pay almost obscenely disproportionately small amounts into the tax system. Some of the biggest corporations don't pay any taxes at all, yet the burden rests on middle class, lower class people to meet, to finance the activities of the country.
Yes.
So we need to speak up on behalf of economic justice. Then we have in this country like racism, especially now, if you know what's going on with the election, regulations are being changed almost to lock the Democratic Party out of the possibility of winning certain state elections.
Thank you very much. Any other comments from any of the venerables on that? I think Venerable Mahā Bhatsakorn already spoke to that to some degree. Okay.
Well, I just would like to say a few words. Well, traditional monk and then the modern monk, we need to distinguish. For example, when the Thai monks first came to the UK, and we prefer to observe the monastic rules strictly. And for example, when we go outside, we didn't wear sock or even a hat or scarf. But because the weather here is terrible, is very cold. So to me, in some way, of course, according to the monastic rules or monastic codes, and it's not right to do something, but we have to compromise, we have to consider the circumstances, we have to consider the culture and situation. When we go outside, for example, if we wear sandals, and then the local people we look at the monks with the big eyes. Oh, the weather is very cold, and why you wear the sandals? So you can't get sick because the weather is very cold. I thought, if I strongly believe that if the Buddha was still alive, he would allow monks to wear soap. He would allow monks to wear shoes. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, in a very cold country. Yeah, this is my personal point of view. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So maybe just one or two last questions. There's a Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi spoke a little bit about this in your presentation, but there's a question that says, how can one present the Dhamma in a directly visible approach to connect ethics with karma and rebirth? Would you like to say a little bit more about that, Svante? I mean, you addressed it somewhat, but I think that would be helpful, sort of examples that you've used to fill out those particular teachings that cover that area to make it possible to talk about that principle of karma and vipaka without having the whole kind of cosmological past life, future life background being a necessity or being expressed in that same way.
Well, one way is the way that I mentioned in my talk, in that you see the direct effect of the moral quality of one's actions upon one's own state of mind and one's own quality of life. That when you sort of indulge unwholesome states of mind, it leads to inner turmoil, distress, conflicts with others, and even if one becomes successful and rich, but still one is never really satisfied or happy. Whereas a person who engages in a lot of wholesome activities, generous, kind, considerate, compassionate towards others, will find happiness even living under very simple conditions. So that, I think, is not really, strictly speaking, the relationship of karma and vipaka in the doctrinal sense, but it shows the immediate impact of wholesome and unwholesome actions on one's quality of life. And so from there, one could project beyond this present life and see how our actions are going to have some continuing impact beyond the present life. And there's one kind of moral argument that I've used sort of it can't absolutely prove the reality of karma and rebirth, but I think it strikes a strong chord in the mind or the heart. I use an example of two people. One is the chief executive of a weapons manufacturing corporation, which is selling weapons to a country which is brutally attacking a poor neighbor. And this executive is, making millions off these weapon sales. Another person will be a doctor who joins this Doctors Without Borders and goes to work in that same country, serving the injured people in that country. Okay, the doctor working in that country is killed by one of the weapons that had been sold to the country by the weapons manufacturer. This doctor dies, she dies, the weapons executive sometime later dies. Okay, if there's no continuation after death, then it means when they both die, everything is wiped out, everything is finished, nothing beyond this. One man has led a very luxurious life, making millions off the sale of weapons. The doctor who has sacrificed her life to help the injured, everything is obliterated. There's just the void of endless nothingness beyond death. That is the case if there's no continuation beyond death. And somehow it seems to me that tears at our deep moral sense that there has to be some principle of justice at work in the cosmos. And for me, that's it can't prove the reality of survival of death, but I would say it provides a compelling moral argument in favor of that hypothesis.
So our time is moving on. So thank you very much for those responses. My apologies to all the people who sent in questions that we didn't have time to give responses for, but thank you very much for thoughtfully putting your inquiries down, and so that one of the principles that Venerable Ajahn Chah used to express from time to time, Lumpur Khemadhammo will remember that Lumpur Chah once in a while said, if you didn't already know the answer, you couldn't put the question in the first place. So look deeply enough within yourself, you'll find where the question came from, and perhaps you'll find the answer to it there. So if you look and see where that question came from within you all as individual questioners, perhaps you'll find some kind of a meaningful response in that internal inquiry. So Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, for about the next 10 minutes or so, if you'd like to give some closing reflections. You've listened to some of the comments of the other monastics here. You've seen some of the questions that have come in. Are there further things you'd like to say, or other things that you'd like to reflect upon to tie this theme together today for all of us?
Okay, one idea that occurred to me, but I didn't get to include it in my presentation, is that it seems to me that as Dhammadutas, as we present Buddhism in the West, what we have to do is to present a kind of integral version of the Dhamma, which brings together, I would at least 3 or 4 threads, which might tend to get separated. I call these the devotional thread, which involves practices of faith, recitation, worship, because the foundation of our life as Buddhists, and I think what separates maybe, there's almost like 2 manifestations of Dharma now in the West. One is what I would call Buddhist Dharma, those Dhamma followers and practitioners who clearly and openly identify themselves as Buddhists. Another is sort of a manifestation of Dhamma, maybe coming out of the secular Buddhists or immanent Buddhists, where there's a little bit hesitation to identify themselves as Buddhists, but to use the expressions like I'm a Dhamma practitioner, but hesitant to say I'm a Buddhist. But our sort of the core of our life as Buddhists is the sense of refuge, taking refuge in the 3 jewels, Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, which is grounded in faith. So I think an important part of Buddhists to transmit the true Dhamma, Buddhist Dharma, to the West requires that one of these threads, irreplaceable thread of practices rooted in faith and devotion. Another second aspect is that of study and learning, to really study the Buddhist texts, to know the scriptures, to know what the Buddha taught, even if one doesn't become a textual scholar, but to be able to get to be familiar with the fundamental principles of the Buddhist teachings as laid down, particularly in the Nikayas, at least amongst all Theravadan Buddhists. Some will also include the Abhidhamma, but maybe the foundation should certainly be the teachings in the Sutta Pitaka. So there should be even systematic study and teaching of the canonical texts. And then for monastics, of course, the Vinaya. So, and then the third thread is meditation practice, which is in a sense the core of our own commitment as monastics. We go forth for the purpose of advancing towards enlightenment and liberation, and that inevitably or absolutely includes some dedication to meditation practice. And then the fourth thread or aspect will be engagement in some kind of social service, which can be teaching the lay people, providing or at least encouraging and spearheading efforts at generosity, charitable undertakings, or in some cases, as I mentioned in my talk, advocating on on issues of social and economic justice and climate sustainability. So we have these 4 threads which can be woven together: the devotional rooted in faith, the aspect of Dhamma study, which sharpens the intellect and understanding, and also qualifies us to expound the Dhamma accurately and properly, the aspect of meditation practice, which enables us to progress along our own path to enlightenment, and the aspect of social service, which is an expression of metta and karuna, loving kindness and compassion in action.
Thank you very much indeed, Venerable Sir. If I might chime in, during your talk, you spoke about immanent Buddhism, that particular way of approaching, and I don't think that there's a lot of people in this event for whom English is not their first language. You and I understood that, and probably quite a number of us did. That there's 2 words in English that sound very, very similar. So immanent with an A in the middle, immanent, and that means present here and now. Yeah. It's here already. And then imminent with an I in the middle means it's about to happen. So, and that was the point that the Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi was making. It's like, well, it's here and now is what he's talking about. This is an immanent reality. So the Paccuppanna Dhamma, the here and now Dhamma, would render as immanent in English. Imminent, it means it's about to happen. It's often the in the kind of expected future. So that just to clarify that one particular point. Another small, if I might add in just my own say comment in the with respect to talking about karma and vipaka, karma and rebirth, and speaking to a secular or materialistic audience or skeptical audience, or a group that doesn't have a background in the ideas of past lives or future lives, that I often, almost always refer to the Apannaka Sutta, which is Sutta number 60 in the Majjhima Nikaya, and I won't presume to try and quote it perfectly, but it's essentially what in Christian theology is called Pascal's wager. It's very briefly and in a synopsis, the Buddha says, there might be this good person who lives an unskillful life. They are dishonest, they're cruel, they're destructive, they're greedy, and so if they act in that way, they will draw unskillful people to them. They will sleep badly at night. They will be prone to anxiety, and so they create an unpleasant destination for an unpleasant situation for themselves here and now. If someone, if there is no afterlife, and it's significant that he kind of makes a point of saying, there might not be an afterlife, but even if there is no afterlife, he's made an unpleasant abiding for himself or herself here and now. On the other hand, if someone lives skillfully, they keep the moral discipline, they're generous, they're unselfish, they're kind, they draw wholesome people to them, they're respected by the wise, they sleep easily at night, and then when their life comes to an end, they have no regrets. And so even if there is no life after this one, they've made a pleasant abiding for themselves here and now. If there is a life after this one, then the one who's lived unskillfully will have created causes to say, incline towards an unpleasant destination, quote unquote. And so then they have what he says, an unlucky throw on both counts. And then if someone lives a skillful life, they've not only made a pleasant abiding for themselves here and now, but they've created the causes for a pleasant abiding in the life after this one. So they have a lucky throw on both counts. So he uses the imagery of gambling. It's a good gamble to live skillfully. And Blaise Pascal, the philosopher, had a very sort of similar, not identical, but a similar format within the Christian theological expression. It's worth living skillfully, even if there is no heaven or hell, because if there is a hell, then you're going to end up with a really long time in a really nasty place. So excuse me for putting that in, but I find that very helpful. And most people, even from junior schools, senior schools, college students and non-Buddhist groups, like the local Women's Institute or the Rotary Club that you're invited to speak to, they can relate to that kind of thing. So maybe we can come to a close now. Lumpur Khemadhammo, would you like to offer some concluding remarks for the afternoon's event?
Well, I'd like to thank particularly Bhikkhu Bodhi for his contribution and for taking the trouble to give us the time today. It's been a great honor, and we're very, very grateful, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. And I hope we'll be able to invite you again, because you are such an invaluable resource. We must make as much use of you as we possibly can. If you don't mind that, but thank you very much. And thank the panelists and organizers and everyone who's made today possible. It's been really marvelous, and I do enjoy these events online. It's really terrific to be able to be in touch with people all over the world without having to go anywhere. It's marvelous. I love it. So thank you all very much. It's been a great day, and I hope we can manage it again in the future. So thank you. I think we ought to just pay our respects to conclude. So if I may. Arahant Samma Sambuddho Bhagava Buddhang Bhagavantang Abhivade Swakato Bhagavata Dhammo Dhammam Namasami Supatipanno Bhagavato Savaka Sangho Sangham Namami